Thank you, Margie. So I'm Anita Banerji. As Margie mentioned, I am the director of what is called the Democracy Initiative at a statewide organization called Forefront. Sorry, I'm trying to switch the slides. So Forefront is a statewide organization for grant makers and nonprofits. We're a membership organization serving to provide best practices, trainings, and opportunity to be able to connect, convene, and think about how to work collaboratively. So when this body of work came to the attention of Forefront, we thought that why not get engaged in the civic engagement space where there's an opportunity to really lean on our nonprofit communities as well as our Illinois philanthropy organizations and see how we can work stronger together, knowing at a time when democracy is very much at stake. We need to ensure that folks are registered to vote, that they actually go out and make informed decisions at the polls, and they take that civic duty a step further for a fair and accurate census count next year. So we broke up our democracy initiative into two areas: traditional civic engagement, and then a separate table for Census 2020. And then we broke that down a little deeper, and we took a page out of Michigan and Minnesota's great work. So in 2010, Minnesota and Wisconsin were the top two states to get the most accurate count in the country. And Michigan wasn't far behind. But Illinois was kind of middle of the pack. We had about a 76, 77% reporting percentage. And that meant that then there were a number of communities all across our state that went unaccounted for. And that also meant we were kind of middle of the pack across the country. Even though we were number 11, I think there were a number of states that were kind of in that bucket. So the big lesson that was learned in 2010 was that we have to rely on our trusted community messengers, our leaders, and we need to coordinate. And we need to coordinate at all levels, whether we're looking at local governments, we're looking at nonprofits, we're looking at business sector, we're looking at philanthropy. We need to find the common thread that can help us rise and fall as a state. So why is the census important? The census is important for three main reasons, and in particular for Illinois. Our first and foremost reason why is that it impacts our congressional representation. So this is what our congressional map looks like today. And it's important to note that since 1950, Illinois has lost one congressional seat in every census cycle. So that means we used to have 24 members in Congress. We now have 18. And keeping with that trend, we will likely lose one seat next year. This is what our map could look like if we lose one congressional seat. And it could come from, many are surmising, the central and southernmost part of our state. So many are saying it could be Representative Boss's seat, it could be Representative Shimkus's seat. Many of you know that Representative Shimkus announced that he will be retiring, but now he is actually reconsidering. But if the census count indicates that we lose a seat, if he's up for re-election and he chooses to come out of retirement, he may not have a seat. But Illinois has also had considerable outward migration in the last 5 years alone. So for the first time in census history, that puts Illinois in a situation where we could potentially lose two congressional seats. Where would that second seat come from? Very likely the greater Chicago area. So this is what our congressional map could look like if we lose two seats from our census count next year. So as you can see from this map, this is very much a statewide issue. One of the ways that folks that want to advocate on the census can be helpful is to learn how to use this hard to count mapping tool. The City University of New York a professor named Dr. Stephen Romalewski put a lot of time and attention in putting this fairly easy tool together. And using this tool, you can go to any state in the country and zoom in on congressional districts, state legislative districts, as well as county districts. And it will show you going from lighter shades of yellow and red all the way to the darkest shades of red, where various pockets of population, historically undercounted populations, reside. And as we know, the US Constitution mandates that every resident across the country needs to be accounted for every 10 years through a decennial census. The purpose of the census is to count everyone, to count them only once and in the right place. So as you can imagine, that is a Herculean task. The second reason why the census is so important is that it impacts state funding that comes from the federal government. So how much money a state receives in any given year and for the next decade is predicated on a fair and accurate census count. So we know from our 2010 census count that Illinois receives about $20 billion annually for 15 large social service programs. That number is actually a lot more when you think about the number of social service programs that residents all across our state utilize in any given day, any given month, or any given year. That number is actually closer to 35 billion for 55 social programs. And that information can all be found through this really great study that Dr. Andrew Reamer pulled together through George Washington University. It's called Counting for Dollars. You can look up the Illinois-specific pages that show the social service programs and the amount of money that comes into our state for those programs. And what I also want to bring to your attention is that Dr. Reamer is starting to look at county level funding. How much money comes in from the federal government to various counties, all 102 counties in Illinois, as well as all of the other counties across the country. Very important information to be able to share with villages, townships, and county elected officials when you look to do outreach on the Census 2020. So what does this mean per person, right? There's so many facts and figures that fly around when it comes to the census, how much money comes in for CDBG grants or CDBG grants or the lunch program, the national lunch program, you name it, and Medicare. All of our census data then helps predict how much money comes in for these various programs. But when you think about how much money one person represents, that number clearly looks different from state to state. So on average, that's about $1,800 a person for 1 year alone. So that's $18,000 that one person that goes unaccounted for is how much money that one person represents that is lost when we don't have that person counted. That's a lot of money. And when you think about that translating into numerous people, that's certainly a lot of money. So for Illinois, because we've had outward migration, our number is a little lower. It's $1,400 a person. And over the course of a decade, that's $14,000. And it may not sound like a lot of money to perhaps an urban environment, but when you look at rural communities all across our state, particularly in central and southern Illinois, that will make or break a home rule determination. It'll make or break a road utility tax, right? All of that is predicated on census data. And it's so necessary that we have our vital federal dollars over the course of the next decade when we have a state that is perennially broke and we're fighting at the state level for necessary state dollars to get to residents all across our state. So the third reason why the census is so important, and this particular reason often goes in the shadows because this is not as reactionary, right? When folks think about the census, you think very quickly about our congressional apportionment and you think about our federal dollars. But what we need to also think about is planning for a better tomorrow. And we can't do that. We can't determine where the new roads, the new schools, the new libraries, the new pockets of population that have come into our state that now need ESL language facilities, that need new hospitals. None of that can happen without accurate census data. And if we want for our small business leaders to thrive, if we want for our communities to have accurate information as we look to the future, we need for our communities to be counted. So how does an undercount happen? Well, in any given census, you have historically undercounted populations. And when people think of the term hard to count, you often think about immigrant communities, undocumented individuals, mixed status families, low-income families, and communities of color. But I'm here to tell you that it is so much more, right? The seniors, the homeless, the children under 5, the renters, all of these are important, historically undercounted populations. When you think about the seniors, right, messaging to them looks very different, and they do rely on their library systems to help them get information. The homeless, many homeless do come to the libraries as a place of security. They do lean on community and rely on them in a way that maybe families that are in more urban environments or transient environments don't. And then children 0 to 5. That is the largest hard to count population in the country. In 2010, there was a study that showed that more than 1 million children of that age range went unaccounted for. Why? We're still trying to figure that one out. But what we're hearing is that it's a myriad of reasons, right? We've got immigrant communities that often live in joint families that don't think to include everyone in their census count for their household come census day. You've got families that don't necessarily understand, regardless of the community of color, that children that may be 2-day-old, a grandchild, a grandnephew, a niece, a 2-year-old, many people don't think that they're full-fledged adults yet. But what they don't realize is if that 2-year-old is not accounted for, and the next decade is held when that person is now 12, that child has lost out on necessary resources or dollars that could be coming to a given district in our state because that person didn't get accounted for when he or she was 2. And then I need to be mindful that the rural communities are very much a hard to count population in the 2020 census, because for the first time in census history, the census is going online. A huge task, and a great accomplishment will be met once the census can go digitally sound. But trying to get to that place is a lot of work. And it really requires for the Census Bureau to be patient, for the Census Bureau to have various modes of information that is shared with folks as they prepare and organize for this big data collection, the biggest data collection through any government entity. And so knowing that our rural communities do not use technology perhaps in the same way that maybe folks in an urban environment might, also knowing that there isn't necessarily access to broadband in the same way there might be in other parts of the state, we have to think about how we do our outreach to folks living in these communities differently. And then finally, the renters. This is a very big population and a necessary one that goes easily unaccounted for, because 4 people may be on a lease, but 6 or 8 may actually be living in the unit. Many people don't fill out the form in its entirety because they don't want, for any purposes, information to get to law enforcement officials or to the landlords, right? We have to be mindful of making sure there's education out there that this information is going just to the Census Bureau and that that information is protected for up to 72 years. So having said that, students, university students are a very big renting population. And many students don't live in dormitories. They live in off-campus or on-campus housing with their friends or their family. And they don't necessarily know that they need to be accounted for where they are 9 months of the year. So for example, if there is a student that lives in Kansas City, Missouri, and he or she is now going to school at Northern Illinois University, that student, if he or she is living in an apartment, needs to fill out the form that comes to that unit during the spring of next year. That education needs to happen through university administration, university leaders, and university student leaders. So we are working, Forefront is working with Campus Compact and the universities of Illinois, the whole Illinois system, as well as Northwestern and the University of Chicago to ensure that they can get that information out, but then also being mindful and that we're getting to the various community colleges, right, where you have a large commuter population. So as you think about this work, right, from the standpoint of libraries, thinking about the whole community is essential in our outreach. So challenges to the 2020 census. I've talked about the various pockets of population, but in any given census cycle, there are a number of challenges. And as I mentioned earlier, the census is going online for the first time ever. And while that's a really great attempt at keeping up digitally, we know that there's a very big digital divide in our country. And we also know that going digital means you have to address various cybersecurity risks and threats. And in order to do that, you need to ensure that your Census Bureau is fully funded. Well, we know that the federal government is now in a continuing resolution, meaning that the budget for the upcoming fiscal year is only partially funded. And that also includes the Census Bureau. So the Census Bureau is housed at the Department of Commerce. And ahead of any decennial census, the administration typically ensures that the Bureau is taken out of any federal fights so that they can be fully funded and staffed to be able to conduct such a big task, data collection task, in the upcoming decennial census. Well, with us in a continuing resolution and the administration not having provided for that security, the Census Bureau has a budget shortfall, which impacts how they go online. And if we don't have all the cybersecurity risks addressed, if we don't have all of the I's dotted and the T's crossed, how do we know how the rollout will be when the census goes online? And with that lack of funding, we also know that there are numerous operations that haven't occurred, such as the end-to-end test. And before any decennial census, there are a number of tests that need to occur before the census goes live. And they're usually held, one in the middle of the country, one in the eastern part of the country, one in the western part of the country. Well, the one that was actually held was in the eastern part of our country, and it was, I would argue, in one of the smallest states of our country. So not an adequate sampling of our population or the diversity of our population. The other issue that we face, and this isn't specific to just the 2020 census, but can impact other censuses, is leadership. At the top level of the Bureau is a director, and that director stepped down in the summer of 2017. And that position was not filled until the start of this year. So you can imagine that Dr. Stephen Dillingham, once he was appointed into the role, had to hit the ground running. And while he has done a wonderful job of trying to keep up and ensure that his bureau is moving as fast and smoothly as it can, these budget shortfalls and the fact that we're going online for the first time in census history are huge tasks that need to be met. And then, of course, there are legal issues, right? With the census going online for the first time, we are using social media to get the messaging out there. And it will be one of the biggest sources of outreach. But with that comes considerable disinformation and misinformation. And when we think about the fact that the proposed citizenship question that came about in March of 2018 was out there for so long, we know that there is now considerable fear and consternation amongst many hard-to-count populations. That means that as community census ambassadors, we have our work cut out for us. And we need to be mindful of dispelling the myths and making sure that people have information that is at the ready and is accurate when we do our outreach. So how do we get to an accurate count? I've talked about the doom and gloom and the various challenges, particularly to the 2020 census. But now we need to think about, how do we move past all of that? How do we rise as a state to ensure that we're getting our necessary federal dollars and that we're also keeping our congressional representation intact, because we know that our congressional leaders are what help us with the various causes that people have to be able to bring them forth at the national level. We rely on our trusted community messengers, and they need effective messages to be able to do this outreach work well. Libraries are a huge trusted messenger all across the state, and obviously that looks different in the greater Chicago area and the central and southernmost parts of our state. But when we think about how libraries are such a central hub for suburbs, for smaller towns, and in particular in the southernmost part of our state, we know that we need to be mindful of how we use these community leaders to help us get the messages out far and wide. So libraries can engage in the census in outreach in a number of ways. The first and foremost being that we can look to use computers and the internet to help people fill out the census. Now, when I say help, I mean literally providing for the laptops, the smart tablets, and the bigger actual computers. But we don't encourage any library staff or volunteer to actually help a person fill out the form. That is up to the individual. They can perhaps ask questions, but they need to be the ones filling out the information on the actual piece of technology. Folks can also use the library to go online when looking for jobs or filling out forms. As I mentioned, the Census Bureau is not fully staffed at this time, and there are a number of temporary positions that are available for citizens and non-citizens. Yes, non-citizens as of last Friday can now apply for these temporary roles. And you can find those various positions at www.census.gov/jobs. Now, each position will have a different set of criteria and requirements, and I don't have that information at my fingertips, but I would highly encourage folks to reach out to the Regional Census Bureau if you have specific questions about those jobs. But if libraries choose to have office hours where they provide for technology and devices to be available for public to come and look for jobs, that would be a really great resource, especially as we get closer to the actual count. If libraries also want to think about participating in local count committees, These are committees that are led by local leaders. Elgin, actually their Gale Borden Public Library leads their local count committee. And I would highly encourage libraries that are part of the rail system, if they're interested in leading or being involved with their local CCCs, to reach out to the Gale Borden Public Library. They're a great resource. So other ways that the libraries in our communities can engage. You can certainly put together events and programs. And being that you are central hubs of community, this is a great way to bring constituents, to bring communities together. And if you can bring local elected officials or congressional leaders or folks from your local CCCs to come and share information, Forefront has come to a number of these gatherings and spoken, as well as Census Bureau officials. Really, it's up to how you want to put the events together, and the more creativity and excitement you can bring, the more positivity that we can lead with, the better our chances are of a fair and accurate count. Libraries can also help by taking initiative in trying to dispel a lot of the disinformation and misinformation that might be out there. To the extent that you can provide for information through your flyers or newsletters, your online materials, or on your library websites, all of this will be pertinent and relevant for community and residents. So a couple of resources I want to provide. Certainly, as we get to closer to the start of 2020, the Census Bureau will have their own marketing materials and ad campaign. But ahead of that, there are great resources that libraries and community leaders, stakeholders, and advocates can utilize. The Funders Committee for Civic Participation has an all things census table. And if you were to look up this link, you would find webinars that have been recorded, fact sheets of various kinds specific to various historically undercounted populations. All of this information is customizable, usable. You can drop your logos in and you can share far and wide. And then the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights is leading the advocate community for the census nationally. They have a census counts campaign, a national campaign that brings states together. There are about maybe 25, 30 states that are most active, but I would say probably closer to 47 are engaged. And this is a great place, a great medium in which states are able to share best practices, challenges that may be unique to one state, but that can be so helpful when you're looking to do outreach collectively. And their website is www.censuscounts.org. And again, wealth of information that folks can take and run with. So what Forefront does is we take that information from our national trusted partners and we try to distill it down so that it's meaningful for Illinois. We do that through two of the statewide tables that we facilitate. One is our advocacy coalition, so this middle block, right? This is our trusted nonprofit community and their leaders that come together regularly to think about how we do this work smarter, not harder. And then we've got our Funders Collaborative, pulling on Forefront's philanthropy membership to help us ensure that we have capacity dollars for organizations to be able to do this work far and wide. And then the third statewide table is the Illinois Complete Count Commission. This commission was created in 2017 by a few state elected officials because we knew that in 2010, there were more than 230 local count committees all across the state, but no one group talked to each other. And we needed a accountability mechanism, if you will, to help bring those local count committees together in some way, not a way to micromanage, but a way to enhance the work. And so this commission, which is the first of its kind in the country, was state statute created that allowed for 22 members across the state to come together on a regular monthly basis. These 22 members have been appointed either through the governor or by the Secretary of State's office, by Secretary Jesse White, and are now what are called census ambassadors. And they are folks that libraries can certainly lean on and ask to attend or present at any community gatherings. The Secretary of State's office brings these community leaders together in public venues that are then available and open to the public in the form of meetings that occur, I want to say it's like the last Tuesday of every month. They have these venues in Springfield as well as in Chicago. I believe the Chicago one is the Thompson Center. The governor's office has a spot where folks can come from the public as well as these members of the commission. Now, what's important to note about this commission is that they have 10 not hard to count. Yeah, actually, it is hard to count. 10 hard to count subcommittees. I apologize. It's been a long day, and this is my 4th presentation this week. So having said that, these 10 subcommittees come together much more regularly than once a month, because they're the ones that are doing the work that then they report out on at these monthly meetings. This table, I believe, engages with the American Library Association. And I would encourage Rails and any other libraries that want to get engaged to connect with the commission to ensure that there is coordination and collaboration. So the Nonprofit Advocacy Coalition, right, that makes up the Illinois Count Me In 2020 program, has 42 organizations that are already boots on the ground. These are also trusted community partners and leaders that libraries can lean on. And you can find the list of these GOTC grantees on the ilcountmein2020.org website. The other thing that our coalition has put forth as a resource is a communications toolkit that went live on October the 1st. It is still a work in progress, but it is one of the first toolkits that are out there in the country from a state perspective. This is information that organizations can take and run with and customize. And as the toolkit is updated, Forefront will make sure that we share that information with our membership. So now there's actually a 4th statewide table. So as you may be aware, and I believe this was mentioned earlier in the presentation, that Rails is now a regional intermediary for the Department of Human Services. This came about from great advocacy work by the Forefront nonprofit Count Me In coalition, as well as the Rainbow Push Census Coalition. We worked long and hard to advocate for a state census appropriation that would allow for these necessary dollars to go out to communities, local governments, and nonprofits all across the state so that we could really rise together as a state. It is important to note that Illinois is one of 3 states with the most to lose in the upcoming census. Next to West Virginia and Wyoming, we look to lose hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars and congressional representation. So in the spring of 2019, after much sweat, blood, and tears, the governor's office and the Illinois General Assembly appropriated $29 million for the census outreach effort, the highest per capita investment in the country, which allows for 19 regional intermediaries to serve all pockets of the state. Some of these regional intermediaries actually serve more than one region, and they will be instrumental in getting the word out. So Forefront is delighted that Rails will be part of this effort, and we look forward to working closely with libraries and the Rails system all across the state to ensure a fair and accurate count. The State Census Advisory Panel helps with the state's advocacy efforts. There are 10 General Assembly members that are part of this panel that can also be utilized as census ambassadors. and there are 2 members from the Illinois Count Me in 2020 Funders Collaborative that also serve on this panel. The state has recently hired 2 state co-coordinators that will be running not only the state grantee program, but the advocacy and outreach program for the various agencies that are part of the governor's administration. This website that is noted below, census.illinois.gov, will be a wealth of information, especially as we get closer to the census count. I encourage everyone to go on the website, get familiar with the information, and to sign up for the DHS stakeholder newsletter. So that's it in a nutshell. It's a lot of information, I know, but it's really important to know that we need to rely on our trusted community leaders to help us ensure that we're getting this information out far and wide. As the census count comes closer, March is going to be a really busy month. Not only is it the month when the letters from the Census Bureau go live asking folks to self-respond, it is also when the Illinois primary elections will occur. So the letters will go out the week of March 12th, and then our primary is held on March the 17th. So you can imagine, in the midst of various organizations doing GOTV, get out the vote, there will also be various organizations focusing on get out the count, GOTC efforts. So in the midst of overwhelming information and inundation of information, we need to be able to think about how we get to the various residents, the various communities, and the various families so that we can provide for a better tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. We had a couple questions come in. I believe the first one is referring to the third to last slide, when it is about the Advocacy Coalition. The question was, great for Chicago, but what about Rock Island County and other non-Chicago areas?
So Rock Island is actually one of the regions that is still outstanding from the DHS notice of funding opportunity, right, for the census dollars. That application is due November the 4th. I have connected with some of the community leaders in that area to think about how they can get regional intermediaries to serve as the hub and the census ambassadors for that region. But Rock Island also has World Relief, which is one of the forefront grantees, doing intentional community work, boots on the ground for the census. So I'd encourage folks to reach out to World Relief. I believe a woman named Laura Fontaine is leading the efforts. And then finally, the Doris and Victor Day Foundation outside of Rock Island, or I believe within the Rock Island area that serves the Quad Cities, is very much a part of our Funders Collaborative and is also looking to do perhaps micro grants to organizations in that area and serves on the local count committee out there as well.
Great, thank you. One last question we had is, where can we find the toolkit that you mentioned?
So that toolkit can be found, so if you look at the bottom, the website, the ilcountmein2020.org, I believe if you look, if you search on that website, you'll be able to find it. It's a PDF, but within that PDF are links that people can click on and get information from.
Okay, great. Those are the only questions we had. And I don't see any more coming in. So thank you so much for presenting on this important topic.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Bye-bye.
Bye.